Okay. I would like to remind everybody to keep their phones dark, silent, and in their pocket. And with that said, let's keep on moving. So let's welcome up Tuesday's top speaker, Lily Annika Anderson, with her thesis, The End of an Error, E-R-O-R. Let's give her a hand.
Can you hear me? Okay. Also, if everyone could keep their masks on for the entire time, that would be lovely. Thank you. Okay. You all set? Okay. Douglas Menjivar was fleeing violence from his home country. In 2013, the Enforcement and Removal Operations, or ERO, detained him. He had no criminal convictions and was applying for asylum, yet he was detained for 22 months. During that time, he faced unimaginable trauma. He was put into a cramped room where he was immediately told by the other inmates to, quote, see, hear, and stay silent, end quote. It only took him a few days to find out why. He woke up in the middle of the night to find that gang members were raping the young man in the bunk under him. Both he and the young man tried to report this to the ERO guards at the facility, but they were dismissed and mocked by the people who were supposed to protect them. Over the next few months, Douglas himself was raped, beaten, and threatened with violence against his family. He tried to fight back and suffered a head injury. And even though his head injury was so severe that he couldn't sleep, he was given no medical care for it. Despite the threats, he tried to report his abuse to the immigration boss at the facility, but the boss mocked him, calling him, quote, more stupid than all the others, end quote, and he refused to help him. Shortly after, the young man who had been raped so many times was deported without justice. Eventually, in 2014, Douglas was transferred to a new facility where he reported his abuse to a doctor. His allegations were immediately investigated, but despite the 4 witnesses that the investigators could have called and the well-known and widespread abuse at that facility, his case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Thankfully, his story ends with him being granted asylum, but that does not excuse the abuse and trauma he suffered and the lack of justice he was given. For too many immigrants in ERO custody, this is the case. Some ERO agents abuse and neglect the people under their care, violating their most basic human rights. Many of them don't get a happy ending. In the wake of 9/11, the focus of immigration enforcement shifted to protecting the country from terrorism and foreign threats. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 established 3 immigration agencies under the Department of Homeland Security, or the DHS. The first is Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, which guards the border and keeps terrorists, guns, drugs, and immigrants from illegally crossing into the country. The second is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which deals solely with legal immigration and is in charge of visa distribution and the naturalization of citizens. Lastly, there is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which enforces civil and criminal laws surrounding trade, customs, and immigration. ICE is divided into 2 main offices. First is Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, which looks into crimes occurring across the border, including human trafficking, child exploitation, smuggling, and customs infringement. The other is ERO, which is the enforcing agency. It arrests undocumented immigrants on their civil violations and detains all immigrants that are arrested by CBP, HSI, and its own officers. It is also tasked with deporting undocumented immigrants. Currently, the undocumented population in the United States is estimated to be at around 11 million people. In the 2020 fiscal year, ERO arrested around 100,000 immigrants and deported just under 200,000. ERO detention facilities typically hold around 45,000 people at any one time. Congress must dissolve and replace ERO with a more humane agency that is separate from HSI. The first reason that ERO needs to be replaced is because it has consistently flaunted its disregard for the authorities of both Congress and the executive branch. Second, it has interfered with criminal investigations, most notably with HSI. Lastly, it has allowed sexual and physical assault to run rampant in its detention facilities without proper investigation. The first reason that ERO should be replaced is because it has violated congressional and departmental mandates. Congress has often tried to regulate ERO, but has been largely unsuccessful. In May 2017, Congress gave ICE $2.6 billion to expand their detention capacity. With this money, they issued a warning that they would not continue to bail ICE out when it mismanaged its funding, which had been happening for years. A report explaining the spending bill submitted by Republican Representative Friedlandhusen stated that ICE had grossly overestimated its detention capacity and bed needs and had been incorrect within a wide margin for years. Now, this budget issue is one that concerns ICE as a whole, but it focuses on detention fund mismanagement, which is the responsibility of ERO. Additionally, the report specifically stated that the fiscal mismanagement, quote, seems to be the result of the perception that ERO is funded by an indefinite appropriation. That is incorrect, end quote. Despite Congress's warning, ICE was back within 3 months asking for another bailout of $91 million. For years, ICE, and especially ERO, has mismanaged its funds and exploited Congress for money that it never should have needed. In 2018, Congress mandated that ERO needed to submit an investigative report into each death that occurred in its detention facilities within 90 days of the death. In a September 2020 report by the Congressional Committee on Oversight and Reform, ERO was found to have failed to follow this law. They submitted the initial report that stated that the death had occurred, but they failed to submit the results of the investigation into whether or not their neglect played a role in that death. This is especially concerning because a Human Rights Watch report had previously revealed that several independent medical experts had found that at least half of the deaths between 2015 and 2017 had been contributed to by ERO's substandard care. Between 2018 and 2020, when this mandate was in place, 33 individuals died while in ERO custody. None of those deaths were investigated, despite what the Congressional Committee called, quote, widespread failures in medical care for detainees, end quote. One of those individuals whose death was never investigated was a woman named Roxana Hernandez. Before she came to America, Roxana had been gang raped and contracted HIV. She fled her home country, Honduras, to escape the violence. She hoped to find a new, safe home, but all she found was a new abuser. An independent autopsy found that someone had beaten Roxana in the ERO facility before her death. Not only that, but in the days leading up to her death, she had reported experiencing nausea, vomiting, fever, diarrhea, and severe fatigue, but had been given no medical care for her symptoms. And even though ERO knew that her death was under investigation, it deleted security footage that very well could have been relevant to her case. The immigrants in ERO's detention facilities deserve better. ERO also does not listen to the orders of the executive branch. In January 2021, Acting Director of Homeland Security, David Pekoski, issued guidelines ordering ERO to focus their deportations only on terrorists, dangerous criminals, and those who had come into the country after November 1st. A February deportation flight to Haiti contained no immigrants that fit the director's guidelines. But it did contain a man who had never been to Haiti and was not a citizen of the country. He had been issued a temporary stay on his deportation order because of this issue, but despite it not being yet resolved, he was deported with very little notice. Both Congress and the executive branch have failed to regulate ERO for years, and the people in its custody have paid the price. ERO must be replaced because almost all of the efforts to reform its management have failed. Secondly, replacing ERO would stop its interference into criminal courts and allow criminals to be more effectively prosecuted. HSI is an office that would benefit from the removal of ERO. Leading up to the summer of 2018, former President Donald Trump enacted harsher immigration policies that led ERO to conduct more deportations. This caused tension between the two offices, prompting several HSI agents to write a letter to then Secretary of Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen. In this letter, they asked to be separated from ERO because its unfavorable public perception was affecting HSI's ability to conduct its duties. The two main reasons for the separation were the need for an independent budget and identity. ERO absorbs a lot of the funding that goes to ICE, sometimes taking money directly from HSI's budget. The agents cited 3 instances of this occurring, including $35 million that was taken from their budget in 2016. According to the agents, these fluctuations in their budget keep them from being able to invest in necessary items such as travel, training, technical equipment, and the purchase of information and evidence. Without these things, it is difficult for HSI to conduct thorough investigations into international crime. Additionally, some local police officers refuse to cooperate with HSI because of their affiliation with ERO, since ERO is tasked with deporting undocumented immigrants, which is a practice that has become increasingly controversial among left-leaning cities. HSI is an investigative agency that spans across the globe. It is imperative that they have the cooperation of every single law enforcement agency, but this has become increasingly difficult because their identity has not been separated from ERO. All 19 agents who signed this letter were special agents in charge of an HSI field office. 19 out of 28 top agents believe that the two agencies cannot continue to coexist because their functions have completely diverged. ERO must be replaced and made a separate agency to resolve this issue. HSI is not the only investigative agency in which ERO has been interfering. In 2017, ERO started coming into courts to arrest undocumented immigrants on their civil violations. San Francisco District Attorney George Gascon voiced concerns that crucial witnesses to crimes may no longer speak out or testify out of a fear of deportation, letting criminals who actually pose a danger to society roam free. Additionally, since many of these arrests were occurring in courts where undocumented immigrants were reporting domestic violence, these actions make it more likely that an undocumented immigrant will stay with their abuser and suffer unimaginable horrors to avoid being detained for their civil violation. Every single person, regardless of their immigration status, deserves to be protected from domestic violence. In January 2021, ERO actually did deport a woman who had witnessed the 2019 El Paso Walmart shooting and who had agreed to testify in court. She was pulled over for a traffic violation and was deported before she could even speak to her attorney. ERO interfered in that criminal investigation, and they have hindered both HSI's and the police's ability to conduct investigations and prosecute dangerous criminals. ERO must be dissolved and replaced with an agency that is designed to help, not hinder, other government organizations. Most importantly, my third reason is that ERO must be replaced because of the frequency and lack of investigation into sexual and physical assault in their detention facilities. ERO agents and other detainees see undocumented immigrants as easy targets because they are facing deportation and can be removed from the country before they can testify against their abuser. In Florida, a man has accused a guard of threatening him with deportation after he refused to perform oral sex on the guard. In another detention facility in Florida, a woman has accused multiple guards of cuffing, macing, and assaulting her. They then filmed her as she showered and washed the mace off. In Washington, a woman has accused medical professionals in her detention facility of raping her. And in El Paso, a woman had reported multiple guards for sexually assaulting her. The FBI was investigating her case, and the DHS had ordered ERO not to deport her until the investigation had been conducted. But before it was over, ERO deported her back to Mexico, where a high-ranking member of a drug cartel had previously sexually assaulted and threatened her. Just imagine going through that kind of trauma and being forced to leave your home country and everything you know behind because of it. Then, instead of being safe and being able to heal, it happens to you again. And on top of all of that, you get sent right back to where it first occurred, into very real danger that it could happen again or worse. That this trauma ever happened to that woman is horrible, but the way it was handled was beyond deplorable. And that woman is not alone in her assaults at the El Paso facility, nor is she alone in her deportation afterwards. At least 2 other women have since spoken out, and another has already been deported following her allegations. Abuse of immigrants is a widespread problem throughout the agency. From 2010 to 2016, almost 15,000 complaints of sexual or physical assault were recorded in ERO detention facilities. That's over 2,000 per year and almost 6 per day. Now, these are just allegations, but that does not mean that they shouldn't be taken seriously. An FBI report released in 1996 found that over a 4-year period, only 8% of rape and sexual assault allegations that were actually investigated were found to be false. If we apply that statistic here, there were still almost 14,000 assaults and almost 5 per day. Even if 80% of all of these accusations were false, there would still be 1 assault occurring per day. Of all of these allegations, only 173 were investigated. Even in the presence of hard evidence, ERO dismisses cases. A young girl who was under 18 was found to have vaginal scarring and a sexually transmitted disease after alleging sexual assault. Despite that evidence, ERO closed her case, ruling it unfounded. The lack of investigation and the very real threat of deportation have created a system where ERO agents and other detainees can assault immigrants with very few consequences. Some ERO agents have been put into a position of extreme power over their victims, and they have abused it to no end. Even in the cases where the perpetrators were other detainees and not ERO agents, the lack of investigation has made the agency complicit in the subsequent abuse. The cycle of abuse and neglect is so ingrained into the agency that it would be very difficult to end it without ending the agency itself. Statistically, 5 people have been assaulted today. 5 more people will be assaulted tomorrow. Some will stay silent. Some will get deported. Less than 1% will get justice. We cannot let ERO keep doing this. They have ignored a dire problem in their detention facility, allowing it to continue. ERO must be dissolved and replaced with an agency that will deal with this problem and not allow it to spiral out of control. Now, many people acknowledge that ERO has a lot of problems that should be addressed, but they suggest that it should be reformed, not dissolved and replaced. However, ERO has shown time and time again that they would not listen to reform efforts. My first point is evidence that ERO does not listen to those in control. Additionally, ERO has excellent guidelines for what to do if a detainee alleges sexual assault, and yet they have allowed that problem to run out of control and become an epidemic in their detention facilities. Congress could create the perfect guidelines, but ERO has proven that it would not follow them. Precedence is another reason that ERO should be replaced. By its own history book, ICE replaced its predecessor, the Immigration and Naturalization Services, because the focus of immigration enforcement was shifting to preventing terrorism. HSI still does this, but just as the functions of the two agencies have diverged, ERO has diverged from its original purpose. The majority of the immigrants they deal with have been in the country for over 10 years without causing enough problems to warrant deportation. The most common criminal offense that an undocumented immigrant is deported for is a traffic violation. These are not terrorists. Some are criminals. Some should be deported, but some are just people who have violated civil law. ERO is not handling the terrorists that they were set up to handle. It should be dissolved and replaced with an agency that has the people in its jurisdiction in mind. Another common argument is that undocumented immigrants shouldn't be allowed to stay here because they broke a law. One might argue that if they walked into Germany without proper documentation, they should be deported. However, this argument is lacking a key concept: context. Many immigrants are fleeing dangerous situations or extreme poverty. Obtaining asylum or refugee status is too difficult for many immigrants because poverty is not a valid reason for applying, and there is a limit to the amount of applicants that can be accepted per year. They deserve a more individualized approach to who is allowed to stay here. Additionally, 66% of undocumented immigrants have already been in the country for over 10 years. 96% of them are employed here. Removing them would have detrimental effects on our economy. Undocumented immigrants pay almost $2.5 billion in taxes, including income tax. Providing a path to citizenship would allow them to get better, higher-paying jobs and contribute even more in tax revenue. Doing so is estimated to increase GDP by $1.4 trillion. Every undocumented immigrant is unique in the dangers that they would face if they were sent back to their home country, and the loss that their community and our country would feel if they were deported. They should be evaluated as such. Our immigration system should never have been allowed to get to the point where people like Douglas were able to be so abused without consequence. Congress must replace ERO with a better, more humane agency that is separate from HSI. In thesis class, when a section of our paper was unusable, the grader would mark it black, which meant turn around, cannot work as it is currently conceived. This is what has happened with ERO. It has consistently flaunted its disregard for the laws and the authority of the government, hindered the functions of government agencies, and allowed abuse to occur to the people under its care. We must turn around. ERO cannot work as it is currently conceived. In Matthew 25, 35, and 40, Jesus tells his followers on Judgment Day, quote, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Truly I say to you, as you do it to the least of these my brothers, you do it unto me." End quote. As a country, we need to welcome the stranger and not allow a rogue agency to abuse them. It is our duty as Americans, Christians, and just decent human beings to fight against the injustice being done to this vulnerable population. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, on Lily's panel, we have, returning from the last panel, Amber Compton. Long ago, Amber graduated from Duke University and enjoyed a career in technology marketing and public relations. She left that industry to become a manager of the Compton household, a challenging but rewarding position she's held since 2003. Matt Thomas is an entrepreneur and engineer, having served in executive leadership roles at several high-tech firms in Austin. He's an avid reader, despite being an Aggie, and enjoys outdoor activities of all types. Matt and his wife, Andrea, live an almost literal stone's throw from here and have 5 kids. Veritas graduates Jacob and Emma, now sophomores at A&M, Jane, a Veritas 7th grader, and twin 7-year-old girls, Charlotte and Nevi. We also have Andy Crone. He married his high school sweetheart, Kate, and dragged her to Austin in 1992, where they have raised their 4 daughters, all of whom love his famous dad jokes. After 15 years in the semiconductor industry, he started a second career teaching science at Veritas, where he is now finishing up year number 12. With his favorite color being purple, he loves serving as the dean of the House of Bonhoeffer, the house which claims 3 of the final Fourum presenters this evening. Troy, my boss, has served in the administration of the upper school at Veritas since 2008 and has been a Defender dad since his oldest started pre-K in 2012. All 4 of his children now attend Veritas: Jude, Greta, Isaac, and Elsie. Troy's wife, Stevie, serves as the Director of College and Academic Advising for Veritas. All right, you guys know the drills with the paddles, so the floor is open.
Okay. Really nice job, Lily.
Thank you.
So I just want to make sure that I'm framing your argument correctly, because at the beginning you spoke about in giving some very vivid examples of the abuses that have taken place in the criminal system within ERO. But then you also talked about some of the other sort of broader issues facing us with our immigration challenges. So I just want to be sure, I know you've said that you want to replace ERO with an agency designed to help the other organizations, but can you talk a little bit more about what exactly is the problem that you're proposing to resolve? Is it the fact that there are abuses taking place within that system, or is it that there's a broader problem with the way ICE is structured in the first place? Can you help me unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both, actually. There's kind of 2 reasons for approaching this, is that there have been a lot of problems that have arisen. There's all that abuse occurring in the detention facilities, which is solely ERO. They are in charge of all detentions, and so replacing them would hopefully solve that problem. And then they also have been, ignoring what the government is asking them to do in certain cases and interfering with other investigations. So there's a lot of problems that have arisen, but I also think it would just be better for the agency to be restructured because its purpose has shifted, like I talked about a little bit in my refutatio. So that wasn't part of my 3 points, but I think that it would be helpful for them to be set up to handle the people that they're actually handling rather than terrorists and really dangerous criminals, because a lot of them, the people that they have in their detention facilities are just asylum seekers or people who've illegally crossed into the country for whatever reason and not necessarily someone who's murdered a ton of people.
Okay, thank you. So maybe then first I can just ask about the concept of the detention facilities themselves and how do you solve that problem? Because it seems as though no matter what you do, you're still going to have undocumented immigrants, to use your phrase, that are here and commit some crime, need to be detained. How do you create an agency then that doesn't have those abuses that you cited? Because if you look across prison systems universally, you face those same types of problems. What is it that you would do differently if you were in charge of creating that new agency specifically to get rid of those abuses in the detention facilities?
Yes, so it is a really difficult problem that does face almost any kind of detention. So it'd be really hard to get rid of it completely, but I think it's worth it to try. And so one of the things that I think could really help is just removing all of the more innocent people, like Douglas, who was an asylum seeker who absolutely broke 0 laws but was still allowed to be in a detention facility with other gang members who were consistently abusing him. So I think if we set up a better system to have those kinds of people not necessarily be in detention, or at least be in a different detention away from people that could harm them, to stop detention on detention abuse as much as possible. I also hope that with restructuring the agency, we would get different-minded people, like not people that want to be in power over immigrants or who are viewing them as threats, but more who want to help them. And I hope that the mindset would help that. But also the most important thing is just getting rid of the current system of reporting abuse. It's very internal. They report it to ERO in the ERO detention facilities. And so if ERO wants to cover up their own agents abusing detention detainees, then they can just do that. And that's a huge problem. So I think that that's the biggest thing that will hopefully fix this problem as much as can be possible.
Yeah, so just a bit of a follow-up. Great job, by the way.
Thank you.
Congrats. So in the Homeland Security Act, there was multiple different agencies
Yes.
that were set up. And in that, I think you said that ERO's main mandate was to arrest undocumented and deport undocumented immigrants. I may be oversimplifying, but I think that's what I remembered you saying. So would you suggest that this new agency would maintain that same mandate or be given an entirely different mandate?
So I think that I'm just proposing restructuring ERO, so it'd be very difficult to give its responsibilities to any other agency. I'd be open to hearing about other people's proposals of completely redoing immigration enforcement. But for my proposal, they would still have detention facilities, they would still be the ones deporting, and they would still to some degree be the ones arresting undocumented immigrants when they find them, because they don't really go after criminals. If the police or HSI arrest someone for murdering someone else and find out that they're undocumented, that's the point where ERO would step in and take them, but they wouldn't go after them for murder. So I think that they would still detain those kinds of people, but wouldn't actively go after someone who came here because they couldn't qualify as an asylum. And in those cases, they would kind of help them navigate the immigration process to hopefully stay here if they're not going to be causing a problem and have been like a vital part of their community. So I think restructuring it to have less detention, less enforcement, and also adding a part of it to help undocumented immigrants as they navigate a really confusing immigration system.
Lily, you mentioned just the process of sort of replacing it with a different agency, maybe with a slightly different approach or mandate, but more importantly, with different people with a different mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could speak to the change where INS reformed to ICE, I guess, back in the early 2000s.
Yes.
And I guess, what did that process look like? I mean, if what they were going after was changing, if sort of what their mandate was changing to go after terrorists,
Mm-hmm.
did it really look like all of these people in INS, you're fired, we're gonna rehire a bunch of new people to go after terrorists that are completely different?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just concerned that if you're gonna get rid of ERO, we're gonna have to replace all these people with somebody else, and that seems like an interesting process to kind of, build up a whole new agency. What does that look
Mm-hmm.
like? What has it looked like?
So I don't know extremely specifically what it looked like back then, but INS was still, to a similar purpose, it still had a lot of the same problems. It was viewing immigrants, in the ICE history book it was saying this, I'm not just throwing a purpose at it. It was, as after the world wars, it was more viewing immigration as keeping the country safe from national security risks, and it wasn't really thinking about terrorists because that was kind of a newer problem that came around in 9/11. And so that was what prompted the complete restructuring. And I would imagine they wouldn't have a problem with just keeping the same people because they would just need to retrain them at best. Whereas mine is going from viewing immigrants as terrorists to trying to help them more than trying to remove them from the country. So I think that it would be, we'd want different people with different mindsets, whereas from the previous transition, it would have been more of the same mindset needed.
Mrs. Compton, you still have a question? Okay, go ahead.
So I just want to, so would you say you want different people? Would you ban people who currently work for ERO from applying to this new agency?
I don't think so, because I know that there are definitely people in ERO that are there for the right reasons, that do want to help immigrants, but I think that they would need to look at their record carefully, like were they ever accused of sexual assault by a detainee? And so it could be a factor, but I wouldn't want to just say everyone who's worked for them previously, you're good to go, you can come to this new agency.
So one of your first point was about how ERO has flaunted the authority of the government. Do you mean ICE by that, or do you mean who's the authority they're flaunting?
Mostly it's Congress. They've started to show more flaunting disregarding the executive branch, which in the case that I talked about was the Department of Homeland Security head. So they've typically had someone as the head of ICE that's been of the same mindset as them, especially throughout the Trump administration, which also was, building a wall and wanting to keep immigrants out of the country. So going forward, they have a new ICE head that was put in this week, and it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that kind of change.
The reason I'm asking that is if you look at it from, let's say we have a child who continues to misbehave, you can replace that child, but really you need to talk to the parents, because the parents aren't, holding their authority. They're not demanding respect. They're not putting in policies and having consequences for this organization. So talk to me a little bit about, couldn't this just happen again with a new organization if we don't have an authority that's demanding authority?
Yeah, absolutely. I've tried to figure out why Congress doesn't go after them more, and I truly don't know. I don't know if they maybe don't have the votes or the process to do that. Maybe it needs to go more through the executive branch. That is a concern that I had, and it's hard because with the executive branch, that would be the way to go, I think. And we're just now seeing a different executive branch that's putting in a new DHS head, a new ICE head, and so I hope that will help. But as long as there are these, kind of widespread problems in detention facilities, and as long as they're reporting abuse inside the agency, the DHS head might never hear about it, and it would be better if we were to just replace it with a new agency. And also, there have been so many assaults that would now be really hard to look into and prove whether or not that happened, and so replacing it would just kind of erase all of that so that we don't have to deal with it, because it'd be really hard, and starting with new people that have not been accused of assaulting immigrants and who would hopefully be able to catch them earlier if they did.
So you have been very careful to use the phrase undocumented immigrants, and you talk about immigrants who are detained, and earlier you said that you wanted to separate out those who were criminals, had committed murder or something, from those who had not broken any laws. But in fact, the people who are being detained almost across the board have actually broken a law, correct? They've come into the country illegally. And so I'm wondering if your approach is aimed at treating all people humanely and as created in the image of God and therefore needing to be cared for, if that's what you're advocating, or if you're advocating for, in fact, by restructuring ERO, actually a change to our immigration policies on the whole, or perhaps some combination of those. Could you help me unpack that a little bit, please?
Yes. So I ultimately do want a change in our immigration policy, but that's not something ERO could do. It would have to go through Congress. So that's more outside of my thesis, but that is kind of what I want. Along the lines of, criminals, they've all kind of broken a law. It's slightly different because when undocumented immigrants come into the country, that's a civil law. So they're not technically criminals and they don't pose a danger to society. So I guess that's more where I'm drawing the line, is violent criminals versus people who broke that civil law for whatever reason. A lot of them were desperate, and I completely understand that, and I think that that should be taken into account in their cases and would reflect less poorly on them as, in their morals.
Lily, in your second point, you noted that the HSI is trying to separate itself from ERO because of the reputation of ERO, and you noted that 19 of the HSI directors had written a letter. I guess you noted 19 of 28.
Yes.
What about the other 9, I guess? They love ERO or what?
I'm not really sure why they didn't. I don't think they submitted their own counter letter explaining why they didn't. I don't know if maybe they were afraid of job security or if they really did like ERO, or maybe it wasn't a problem in their region. If they're in a really Republican area, then they probably wouldn't have run into the problems of the local police that won't cooperate with them. So I don't know specifically what their perspectives were.
So on your first point there, you talked a lot about the financial mismanagement,
Yes.
and it seems like most of your evidence related to ICE, and then you concluded that ICE and especially ERO has mismanaged their funds. I'm wondering how you got that especially ERO and not just all of ICE was doing the mismanagement of funds.
Yes. So I probably talked through it really fast, but I had a few sentences in there talking about how Congress was giving ICE $2.6 billion for their detention capacities and their beds, and that's all under ERO. ERO manages all the detention facilities. And then the representative who'd written the report specifically cited ERO as being the problem. So that led me to think that even if HSI maybe contributes a little bit, it's mostly ERO that is causing the fiscal problem.
So with this proposed new agency, if someone is picked up for being an undocumented immigrant, walk me through what an ideal process would be like for that immigrant. Like how long would it take? You mentioned an individualized approach for each of these immigrants. Kind of walk me through about how long that would take, or where they would go, who would be in charge, what the different options would be for them at the end of their process.
Yes, so it probably would take more time, but I think that the goal, what we want to optimize the most, is justice occurring, even if it does take more time, and we could hopefully, refine that with putting in more immigration judges if needed. But I would hope that if they don't pose a danger to society, if they don't have violent crimes in their past, that they would be able to not be detained inside of an ERO facility so that they would not be put in danger. They have a small program right now to allow people not to have to be in detention facilities. I don't know what the requirements are for that and how they determine who can do that, but I would hope that they would be able to, stay with their family, especially if they have one, because it could take a while. And then just looking into why they came here, what they've done since they've been here, and just analyzing what the loss we would feel if they left and if they're still in danger in their home country, and allowing the immigration judge to view all of that as evidence rather than just they broke a law when they came here, they should leave.
So this is kind of a follow-up to a question from a little while ago, so it's going to sound familiar, but you said that efforts to reform its mismanagement have failed, and you made it sound like we have exhausted all options. I'm curious, can you go into some, just hit snapshots of all of the things that we've tried to exhaust all options to reform it?
Okay, so mostly it's just what I covered in my first Confirm audio. It's a really young agency, so we haven't tried a whole lot, and the focus of immigration has shifted a lot during that time. So mostly I'm just looking at what Congress has tried to do. You know, ICE and ERO especially has not listened when they try to tell them what they should do with their money, and they've mismanaged that. And I mean, the death thing to me is really concerning, that they won't adhere to a mandate to investigate the deaths that most likely they kind of contributed to, at least a little. That concerns me, that they're just ignoring that. And right now, the Biden administration hasn't focused a lot on immigration, but I think that over the next coming months, it'll become increasingly clear that I think it will become increasingly clear that reform is not an option. I hope somehow it works, but I don't think it will, just because they've shown themselves more to have a mindset of immigrants being problems in our country that they want to deport, rather than wanting to do what the administration deems to be the best thing for our country.
So now that we've exhausted all options and you're advocating for elimination and replacement, how does that happen? And is there anybody else advocating for that as well? I mean, are there congressmen who are advocating for it? I mean, because they would obviously be the ones who would need to pass the laws to make the changes.
Yes, so ERO is kind of like, replacing ERO is a smaller, watered down version of abolishing ICE, basically, because I modeled my proposition off of the only abolished ICE legislation that's ever been put into the House in 2018, which proposed that ICE be gotten rid of and replaced. And they had a congressional committee get put together with equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans from both the House and the Senate, and then a number of immigration experts to come together, find the essential functions of ICE, and then figure out a way to put them into a new agency that would be more humane and that would not have the problems that the current manifestation of ICE has. So it would look pretty similar to that. And so you have him, the guy who proposed that, and I think he had like very few co-sponsors, around 7. This was the very beginning of the Abolish ICE movement, and since then, you know, it's gained traction with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and more of the progressive Democrats. I believe Senator Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have both supported it, so it's gaining traction right now, but we'll see how it goes.
Can you may have said this already, but can you tell me how many ERO detainee facilities there are?
I don't have an exact number. There's quite a few all over the country.
And do you know how many agents there are that work for ERO?
I did try to find that, and I couldn't. I can tell you that the inmate to correctional officer ratio was 4-to-1 in 2018.
Okay.
But I don't have the
And I'm asking this
specifics on who
because
they are.
you know, you mentioned widespread abuse. Do you know, is it all facilities or is it just 1 or 2? You know, are we talking about a pocket of rogue evil agents, or are we talking about the whole system is broken?
Okay. I don't have specific statistics, but from what I looked into, I can tell you that it is pretty widespread. There's a lot of allegations coming from a lot of different detention facilities, and that study from the almost 15,000 complaints had them from a lot. There are typically some problem facilities. The one Douglas was in Conroe, and it's well known for having a lot of abuse. And the woman who is from El Paso, it's a very new case, but her lawyers are alleging that it's basically systemic abuse occurring at that facility to a lot of different detainees, including her and the 3 other people that have spoken out with her. So it is pretty widespread across a lot of detention facilities.
I'll be honest, I've never heard of ERO before tonight, so I would imagine a lot of people are the same way. I mean, there's been some pictures in the news over the last couple of years about detention facilities and what they look like, and you know, people kind of react to that. Are those ERO facilities that we're seeing on the news?
Probably. CBP also has its own facilities, but they're not supposed to hold undocumented immigrants that come to the border for more than 24 hours. So I imagine the main problem would probably be ERO facilities, which are pretty famous for not being great.
And just to follow up on that, is it standard practice in other detention systems to house different levels of offenders altogether?
I believe in our criminal justice system, that's how we do it. There are maximum, medium, and minimum security prisons. And I think I read that Euro has some level of that, but they still end up with asylum seekers and gang members in the same facilities.
And that's our time. Thank you, Lily. All right, we'll be back at 6:35.